name is Sophia Flowers, and today I will be presenting my thesis on the state's right to secession. Currently, the individual states in the Federal Union of the United States of America do not have the right to extricate themselves from that union. This restraint on the powers of the states is in direct contrast with the values expressed by the Founding Fathers when writing the foundational documents of our country: the Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, and Constitution. The natural rights of man, expressed by John Locke in 2 treatises of government, are foundational to the Constitution's logic. The illegality of secession, effectively giving the federal government the opportunity for exponential expansion, directly violates those rights and does not hold in the spirit of the Constitution. In 1921, the Isle of Ireland was one country and a part of the United Kingdom. However, the northern and southern regions of Ireland differed vastly in culture, politics, and priorities. According to the University of Rochester, over the past 100 years, the northern region had grown increasingly Protestant, along with Great Britain, while the southern region grew increasingly Catholic. As tensions between these two denominations reached an all-time high, the South began to find themselves overruled and outnumbered in government. The South finally decided that they had enough and that they wanted home rule returned and to leave the United Kingdom. In response to unrest, Parliament drafted the Governance of Ireland Act, which aimed to separate Northern and Southern Ireland into 2 distinct countries with governing bodies of their own, while retaining both as a part of the United Kingdom. The North happily accepted this act, and then became an independent country operating under the larger government of the United Kingdom. On the other hand, the South did not accept the act, and unilaterally decided to secede from the United Kingdom. The Irish War of Independence ensued and ended in 1921, with Southern Ireland, also known as the Republic of Ireland, retaining its independence and the ability to self-govern. Over 100 years later, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are coexisting peacefully and have been able to govern themselves specifically for their people's needs, which has led to the optimal living environment for all citizens involved. In this paper, the natural rights of man and the derivation of government's power are discussed. While governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, this paper considers the legality of secession in such a case where those rights are not being protected to their citizens and harm is being caused to the constituents. In 1689, John Locke was the world's most prominent philosopher whose ideas on the roles of the governors and the governed revolutionized the world. Thomas Jefferson himself, one of the founding fathers of America, who penned the Declaration of Independence, said of Locke that he is one of the 3 greatest men who have ever lived, and is having laid the foundations for those superstructures which have been raised in the physical and moral sciences. Locke's philosophies affected Jefferson deeply, and his ideas on men's unalienable rights to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness shaped Jefferson's writings in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. Another topic explored at length in Locke's essays is the roles of government. Governments, Locke claims, are originally founded to serve the common good, and do serve the common good in their infancy, or else they would not survive past that stage. However, once a government is fully established and the original founders step out of rule, it is the tendency for the discrepancies between the interests of the governors and the governed to grow. When a country flourishes, the leader of that country is bound to experience the luxuries that come from an enriched country, and subsequently, their interests no longer coincide with that of the common people, but rather with amassing more luxury for themselves. When such a thing happens, and a government ceases to serve the common good, the constituents are forced to find out ways to restrain the exorbitances of and prevent the abuses of that power. The end of government is the good of mankind, and if that end is not met, it is the constituents' right to institute one that will. There are 2 main schools of thought whenever it comes to enforcing the Constitution: originalism and textualism. Originalists claim that the Constitution should be enforced taking into account perceived legal intent derived from legislative history. This includes taking into account political morals, problems, and ideals at the time of the Constitution's writing. On the other hand, textualists claim that the actual text of the Constitution, devoid of intent, should be taken into account when interpreting it. The state's right to secession is clearly existent when using either an originalist or textualist point of view. Under the 10th Amendment states that the powers not delegated to the United States under the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states, are thereby reserved to the states respectively and their people. Secession is not mentioned in the Constitution at all, so, therefore, the 10th Amendment applies and secession is legal when using the textualist view of the Constitution. On to the originalist view. Before the Constitution was ratified in 1788, 9 out of the 13 states had to individually write, read over, approve, and send in their ratification letters before the Constitution could come into effect. Virginia, the 10th state to send in their letter, wrote specific claims into their letter that asserted their right to reclaim governance and their independence should the United States begin to harm its constituents. They said that the powers given to the federal government, being derived from the people of the United States, may be reassumed by them whensoever the same shall be perverted to injury or oppression. This simply states that all power that the federal government has comes from the people of the United States, and at any time, should the United States begin to harm its constituents, they reserve the right to reclaim the power of governance. New York's ratification letter held a similar statement, saying that they could reclaim the power of government should the United States fail to do its duty. They said that the powers of government, being derived from the people, may be reassumed by them whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness, meaning that if at any time the United States begins to obstruct the pursuit of happiness, they reserve the right to revoke the power of governance and reinstate it to the people. These claims bring to light the original intentions of the Founding Fathers when entering into the Union under the Constitution. The Founding Fathers originally intended for the powers given under the Constitution to be revocable in a case of misuse. The states were wary of entering into a union from which they could not voluntarily leave, effectively surrendering their sovereignty. The most plain of these reasons would be the fact that they had recently fought in the Revolutionary War against Great Britain, a country whose drive to centralize power had quickly led to authoritarian policies and harmed the American colonies. The Constitution created a significantly more centralized government than that of the Articles of Confederation. So, the states were obviously wary of entering into the Union. So, the Founding Fathers left secession out of the Constitution with the intent of leaving the right up to the states so that they would be less reluctant to sign on to the Union. So, the original intent and purpose of the Constitution should be respected in the federal government's recognition of the states' right to secession. One of the main arguments surrounding the existence of the right of secession in the United States is that the Constitution, specifically the preamble, makes the statement in order to form a more perfect union. The existence of a more perfect union indicates the existence of a less perfect previous one. This less perfect union would be the one discussed in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation had created a weak central government without the ability to enforce laws or collect taxes, both oversights that the writers of the Constitution sought to amend in the new supreme law. However, under the Articles, the states did agree to certain Articles of Confederation and perpetuity. So, under the Articles of Confederation, no state could voluntarily leave. Anti-secessionists claim that since the more perfect union of the Constitution directly follows that of the perpetual union of the Articles of Confederation, the new union must also be perpetual, or else it could not be considered more perfect. This logic, however, fails to recognize the fact that the union under the Articles of Confederation did dissolve upon 9 states' ratification of the Constitution. In 1788, whenever the Constitutional Convention met, they were supposed to edit and improve the Articles of Confederation. However, that June, when the convention emerged, they emerged with a new body of law, the Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, there had to be a unanimous vote with 1 vote per state in order to make any amendment to the document. However, the convention decided to do away with this requirement entirely and only require 9 out of the 13 states to ratify the document before it came into place. Once these 9 ratified it, the power under the Articles of Confederation dissolved completely, and the remaining 4 states were left as independent sovereign nations, not under any pact with the other 9. The last of these states to ratify, Rhode Island, held this status as an independent state for over a year before it finally decided to sign on to the Union under the Constitution. So, the Union under the Articles of Confederation cannot be described as perpetual, and therefore, the Union under the Constitution cannot be either, unless it is specifically enumerated in the document, which it is not. There is a famous quote that says, "The victor is always the judge, and the vanquished the accused." We saw this principle played out in real time during the aftermath of the Civil War. The federal government, having been purged of all Confederate sympathizers, by a law barring anybody who had served in the Confederate Army from serving in Union government, decisively put an end to the secession discussion with no regard for the meaning of the Constitution, but rather only with subduing the South. Two main modes of this narrative control were public speeches given after the war and new legislature passed after the war. One main example of this legislature was the Supreme Court's decision in the Supreme Court case Texas v. White. In 1851, Texas was issued 5,000 United States bonds valued at $1,000 apiece, totaling a sum of $5 million held in United States debt. When, in 1861, Texas seceded from the Union by convention, they still held a number of these bonds. And in 1865, when Texas Treasury began to dwindle, they initiated the sale of 135 United States bonds and coupons to persons George Childs and John White. After the Civil War had ended and Texas government was refilled with Union sympathizers, the Texas government sued White for the return of his bonds to the Texas government. The case ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with Texas, claiming that they had never lost their status as a state, and since the bonds were not endorsed by a governor, but rather a military board in armed hostility, the sale was not valid. The main question of the court case was this: where is the location of sovereignty in the United States, and was the rebel government of Texas valid? According to the Supreme Court of 1868, the location of sovereignty in the United States was in indestructible states in an indestructible union. The definition of sovereignty is supreme power or authority over oneself. This statement gives the impression that sovereignty in the United States is split, leaving significant powers to the states while still emphasizing the perpetuity of the Union. In order to properly reassimilate the states, they had to have been considered states all along and still retain some semblance of their dignity and independence. The Union wanted to avoid, I'm going to go back a little bit. In 1851, Texas was issued 5,000 United States bonds valued at $1,000 apiece, totaling a sum of $5 million held in United States debt. When, in 1861, Texas seceded from the convention, Texas seceded from the Union by convention, they still held a number of these bonds. And in 1865, whenever Texas's treasury began to dwindle, they still held a number of these bonds. In 1865, when Texas's treasury began to dwindle, they initiated the sale of 135 United States bonds and coupons to persons George Childs and John White. When, after the war, Texas government was refilled with Union sympathizers, they sued White for the return of his bonds to the United States government, claiming that Texas had never lost its status as a state. The case went to the Supreme Court, where they decided that Texas had never lost its status as a state, and since the bonds were not endorsed by a governor, but rather a military board in armed hostility, the sale was not valid. The main question of the court case was this: where is the location of sovereignty in the United States, and was the rebel government of Texas valid? According to the Supreme Court of 1868, the location of sovereignty in the United States lied in indestructible states in an indestructible union. The definition of sovereignty is supreme power or authority over oneself. This statement gives the impression that sovereignty is split in the United States, giving the states significant power while still emphasizing the perpetuity of the Union. However, in reality, sovereignty was not split in the United States, and the states had lost the majority of their sovereignty whenever they lost their ability to leave the Union at will. So then the question becomes, why did the Supreme Court give the impression of split sovereignty whenever that was not the case? The answer is in the need for Reconstruction. In order to properly reassimilate the southern states back into the Union, they had to have been considered states all along and still retain some semblance of their dignity. The Union wanted to avoid bringing the southern states back in as conquered territories so that they could begin to coexist well again. The only way to do this was to delegitimize the Secession Act completely and claim that instead the southern states had become disorganized and in need of intervention. So, the phrase indestructible states in an indestructible union was coined, and the Secession Act was delegitimized, not through faithful interpretation of the Constitution, but rather through the need for Reconstruction. This new interpretation of the Constitution brought us much further from the original from the intended federalism of the original Constitution and towards a much more centralized version of federalism. The Founding Fathers would have been alarmed at this new shift in the power balance in the United States. At the United States conception, all authority was placed in the states severally, and the states individually bought into the Union under the Constitution with the impression that they could leave in a case of constitutional power misuse. Now, all authority is placed in one American people, superseding the value of the states as semi-independent regions. And while the final nail in the coffin for the federal government's supreme power over the state's sovereignty came during the need for Reconstruction, this trend started decades earlier and was the cause for the Civil War. In 1825, Thomas Jefferson wrote to William Giles, "You see, as I do, the rapid strides with which the government is advancing toward the usurpation of all rights reserved to the states, and the consolidation in itself of all powers, foreign and domestic, and that too by constructions which, if proved legitimate, may leave no limitations to their power." Thomas Jefferson was discussing the rapid centralization he saw in the United States government. He claimed that elected officials, instead of faithfully interpreting the Constitution, were instead manipulating the meaning of the Constitution in order to give themselves more power. He made a statement that showed just how dire he believed the situation would get. "We must separate from our companions only when the sole alternatives left to us become the dissolution of our union with them or submission to a government without limitations of powers." Even so, Jefferson believed that secession was a drastic option and should only be used in the most extreme of cases, but at the end of the day, it was up to the states. So, Jefferson urged that the states hold on to the Union just a little bit longer until they could no longer stand to stay in the Union anymore without surrendering their sovereignty. Jefferson, without a doubt, believed in the existence of the states' right to secession. This standpoint reflected back on the philosophy which America was founded on, the natural rights of man. James Madison, another founding father, held an opposing view. He said that secession in response to intolerable oppression is just another name for revolution, and an act which is uncontrollable by laws anyway, and that secession in any other case will only lead to a weak union. He said, "But this dodges the blow by confounding secession at will with secession in response to intolerable oppression. The former answers itself, being a violation of a faith solemnly pledged without cause. The latter being another name only for revolution, about which there is no theoretic controversy. While you can argue that secession in response to intolerable oppression is simply another name for revolution, for Madison to completely discount secession at will leaves only room for the state of the United States to degrade to such a point where violent revolution is necessary. The sovereign parties to a union should be able to realize that their interests are diverging and create a peaceful solution to go their separate ways without the need for violence and war." The underlying problem is the centralization of power in the federal government. The original purpose of the federal government was to serve the people of the United States through things like interstate commerce and foreign affairs. But over the past 300 years, the federal government has begun to overstep these bounds into social issues, such as things like environmental law and gun law. America spans 3.8 million square miles and is home to over 330 million people. America is home to numerous vastly different cultures with different interests and values. It is not so crazy to assume that people from, say, Texas or California could have differing interests. So, whenever the federal government centralizes power in itself and inserts itself into these social issues, it is not crazy to say that they could not be acting in the best interest of all people involved. Textually, the right of secession is there through the 10th Amendment, and originally, we can see that the Founding Fathers intended for secession to be a right and discussed it numerous times. So, the federal government should recognize the state's right to secession and reinstate the state's sovereignty to the people. Thank you.
Sophia, you have always been my student that can talk about anything. You know a little bit about everything, and I know it's because you read so much. You're so well read. what led you down the path to want to choose this as your senior thesis? And then does it have anything to do with your favorite novel?
Maybe. So my mom really likes history, and so I had fun talking about this with her. And then last year, during, I guess it was April that we were choosing our topics, I was reading Gone with the Wind, which is my favorite book, and I just really wanted to use it as my classical reference in my thesis. And so I kind of was looking into the Civil War and problems with that, and I just thought secession was interesting. I wound up not using it in my paper, but secession was really interesting anyway.
I still made the connection. You did a good job. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Mr. Davis?
Thank you. I'm curious what you would see as any relevance to this topic to like modern day realities. Yeah.
So that's a question that I had at the beginning of this writing process as well, because it seems like the states are so dependent on the federal government now that secession wouldn't even be an option. But it reminds me of Landon's thesis a lot, in the fact that it's just the recognition of the fact that the states are supposed to be the sovereign parties in the United States and that they should have the most power over themselves. So it really is just another form of a check and balance on the power of the federal government. So if the states don't have the right to secede, and that's not threatened by by them at any point, then the federal government is just going to continue expanding its powers with no check.
Thank you. I also thought it was really interesting your quote about Locke about how when power when things are initial, the people have the power, but as things grow, the leaders have the power, and the protections are actually to protect, the state and the people from the abuses of leaders. And that seems to have a lot of relevance to today. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I really liked that quote from my readings of Locke. We read that a lot in history this year. And so I think he was just basically saying, whenever you put a fallen, corrupt human into a position of power, I mean, they say that power corrupts all. And people are just going to want to accumulate more power for themselves. And so whenever we wrote the Constitution, it really is to just protect the people and to limit the scope of the federal government. Because you see, in the 10th Amendment, all powers are given to the federal government and the rest of it is left to the people so that they can protect themselves.
Thank you.
Mr. Clay?
Sophia, good job. I know that your research revealed a lot more information about this idea of secession and how it was dealt with, particularly in the Civil War, maybe its aftermath. Are there any other points that you would make, especially regarding maybe the way that secession was dealt with or possibly not dealt with in the aftermath of the Civil War?
Yes, so there's actually an interesting story about Jefferson Davis, one of the leaders of the Confederacy. So the decision in the Supreme Court against secession was made completely through Texas v. White, which had a lot of different components in it, like the bonds not being endorsed by a governor, different things. Jefferson Davis was one of the leaders of the Confederacy who should have logically been tried for treason, but he was never actually brought to trial because then the federal government would have had to head-on face the problem of secession, and that alone to decide if Jefferson Davis was guilty of treason. So they never tried him so that it wouldn't have to go back to the federal government, because I'm assuming they were nervous that their previous decision would be overturned and secession would be made legal.
So I want to understand what you just said a little bit better. So when the war ends, I know there are a lot of agreements. They let the rebel soldiers go home without prison time. They couldn't run for office, you said, but they kind of got off better than anyone thought they would. But are you saying that the one of the motivations for that was if they were tried, they would be treated as a legitimate nation, and the Confederacy is not willing to even entertain that thought? Does that make sense? What I'm asking you?
Yes, sir. So that is pretty much what I'm saying. So if they were to try Jefferson Davis or those soldiers for treason, then they would have to say that they did something illegal under the Constitution, secede. And so they would have to decide, is secession legal or not? And I mean, there are...
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Sounds like they made a political decision instead of a legal decision, right, to
Yes, sir.
accomplish those things. The question I have, Sophia, is I'm just thinking about, Mr. Davis touched on this. It seems like the the longer the United States goes, it seems like the less likely secession will happen. Because, I mean, maybe when the United States began, we were more individual communities and states that seemed very, very separate and different. Somebody's thesis talked about how every state had a different denomination. I don't remember what it was. But just, that wasn't my son's, was it? No, I don't think it was. Okay. Every state had a different denomination, so it seems like they were very distinct and different. And now, the longer we go and the more modern we become and intertwined, it seems like the more difficult that possibility becomes. That's a lot of setup for my question. I just kind of wonder if you thought about this, what are the issues that could, if you're kind of being a prophet and saying what could potentially be an issue that would divide our country to the extent of considering any state considering secession? Are there any like hot button issues or like danger zones or things that you would be like, send up the warning, we need to watch this to make sure? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, sir. I think that you see kind of some of that going on already. Like, I mean, Texas, sometimes they're joking, but I don't know. Texas is
They're
kind
not.
of, maybe they're not
They're
joking.
not.
They talk about secession a lot. And I think that there's been a lot of accumulation of small things that the federal government has done that a lot of states see as overstepping that would make them want to secede or go a different direction. And also, I mean, you see a lot of division in like foreign conquests or wars that the United States is going on, and so I would think that there could come a point where the United States decides to get involved with a war that could be extremely divisive.
It seems like money could be an issue too, like how money is always a hot button issue, how money is divided. Well, that's good. Thanks.
Sophia, you have a statement in your paper, and it says the government's main modes of controlling this narrative were through public speeches and the creation of new legislature after the war. Which one of the two? You're saying that both of them help the government control the narrative. Which one of the two is more effective? Public speeches or new legislation?
I would say that they both are in different ways. So I would say the public speeches, specifically a lot from Abraham Lincoln, actually, which, if you read into them, are actually a little bit misinformative. But he talked to...
So it's nothing new, is what you're saying.
Yeah, but he gave a lot of speeches at the time to people in the North, and so those were very effective at the time. But over the span since the Civil War to now, I would say legislature, specifically Texas v. White.
Okay. You can probably take a couple questions from the audience. And if there aren't any, you can
All
wrap it
right,
up.
well, if there are no further questions, thank you.